Massive thank you as always to our top tier patron, Sarah Turner. It's Not Just In Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet, substance use disorder counsellor Ecoy Hero, and myself, the editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So, if you can afford to give, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making the show. However, if you can't, then please just leave a review on your podcast platform of choice, tell your friends about us, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube. Massive thank you as always to Elle for organising our monthly reading groups and episode discussions, which you, dear listener, can join in too. Just head over to our Eventbrite page, and the link is in the show notes.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
This episode is talking about the mental health crisis and attending issues that we see in our youth, especially post-pandemic. Go ahead, Derek.
So I'm a teacher. I work with at-risk populations as well as high-functioning ones. I also work with specifically a hybrid program, which attracts a lot of students who have social anxiety. And I'm going to have when we talk about the state with mental health with young people, one thing I'm going to say is we can't disaggregate that from a bunch of social inputs and general learning inputs, because I am going to risk in this episode sound like an old boomer yelling at clouds, but I'm getting tired of reports that are trying to downplay how severe a lot of the evidence we have right now is. And then when someone who's politically questionable, like Jonathan Haidt, starts talking about, for example, the suicide epidemic and rates of depression, particularly depression amongst young women, which is self-reported but at an all-time high, everyone goes on and gives their opinion as to why that's the case. And most of them are, frankly, facile.
You mean that they shouldn't be getting married and just having kids and just being happy?
Honestly, when I think about this, I think about what left feminists said on Twitter, which I also found ridiculous. Like that it was just capitalism or it was just the patriarchy. I'm like, well, the patriarchy has been a pretty constant for 100 years. So that's an explanation that's both probably true in some way, but doesn't actually tell us a damn thing. Conversely, when you read Haidt blames it on social media does not help. There's plenty of evidence for that going back a decade. But it is hard to blame it solely on that because social media's effects are partially related to its content. And its content is socially produced. Therefore, saying that it's all social media's fault begs the question, why is this form of mediation leading to this particular kind of content? When it comes to education, which is what I deal with, we also have a problem of, frankly, general literacy. And I can go into that, but literacy has basically been stagnant from the 1960s to 2014 and in 2015. So this can't be blamed on Trump. This can't be blamed on anyone factor. It can't even be blamed on TikTok. You started seeing a decrease in higher level students being able to read beyond a fourth grade level. And then post-COVID, now this can be blamed on COVID, so I don't know how long it'll stick. We started seeing a decrease in students being able to read at lower levels. So you started seeing problems with students as young as fourth grade, meeting basic literacy skills. Now, to get really cynical about that, and this is a true fact. For example, prison planning is one of the factors that a state looks at when it's looking at how many prisons to build. And we can think of this as how are you going to house your surplus population? They look at fourth grade reading rates. There's a complex causal chain here. I'm just pointing that out. In regards to a lot of what's happened in schools right now, there's a politicization of social and emotional learning and trauma-based practices. I am somewhat skeptical that they work, mostly because the people being asked to do them have a 2-hour training on them once every 4 years and are being asked to implement them in a slew of things that aren't designed for that implementation and implement things like restorative justice practices, which frankly, and again, a lot of people might consider this a conservative stance on my part, but I'm going to say it, don't work in a public school environment because the amount of resources it requires to do restorative justice correctly is actually higher than in traditional punitive education, but it's used to basically do nothing. So you have a whole lot of social conditions that are magnifying. At the same time, we got objective evidence that kids bully each other less, that there's a lot less bigotry amongst them. And while there is plenty of evidence that, for example, this current anti-trans stuff has made the entire LGBTQ community, which is already pretty vulnerable to suicide, particularly out in the Mountain West, get worse. So I don't want to say there's no immediate inputs. There absolutely are. It's not explanatory of all that we're seeing. And my professional work is not directly in this. I'm not a student health counselor. I'm a department head. I work mostly in literacy, but I've just seen, for example, and these are just ballpark numbers, that it usually happened when I started teaching 16 years ago, and this was at a different state, and state suicide ideation, hospitalizations, and suicide attempts do vary. I mean, Utah's one of the highest, but you did not see suicidal ideation, say, in minority students very much. You also only had usually 1 or 2 students hospitalized for an attempt a year. And this is, most teachers have between 180 and 250 students. So that's not insignificant in a country of 320 million. So understand the numbers of that. That's still a lot. But now, in my program deals with kids, a lot of kids who choose my program have anxiety and whatnot, so that's probably an exacerbating factor. But since around 2014, we've seen massive growth in suicidal ideation hospitalizations. On average, a teacher will now have 3 to 5 a year. I've had as many as 20. And I say that in a year. So that's just the ones we know about. That's the ones where someone's been hospitalized, there's been a report. And one of the ironies about this, because of the change in U.S. law, are medical and personal information requirements. Teachers often don't even know when this has happened to students because they often can't be told unless they are a teacher of record. So the school can't mobilize to stabilize this because it's blocked by law. For good reason.
How much can a school do anyway in that sort of situation, right? Because the school environment clearly has a significant influence on a person's life because they're spending a certain amount of percentage of their time there. But presumably, school might be a factor in some of the suicide ideation, but I assume it's coming from somewhere else and or life circumstances.
I would too. If we are seeing a decrease in reported bullying and an attitude where bullying is not okay, we cannot assume that school bullying is the primary cause, right? Because we have data for that too. So what does that mean? Another thing that you have to remember in the U.S. context is child services is basically, unless you're extremely poor or extremely rich, you can afford private child services, all provided through the school system. Our social welfare net for children in the United States is mostly been backdoored down through the school system. That's where there are counselors. That's where we can guarantee meals. That's where most of the child care is. And in COVID, it made it very explicit because basically there was a social crisis because of lack of child care, not just because of lack of education. Let's be honest about that. And across the board, what you saw is, there are no resources once the school shut down. And while that's somewhat true in Britain and France and the older countries in Europe, it is not nearly as true as it is in the United States.
Yeah. One of the things I'd be interested to pick your brain on, this is a slight aside, so perhaps I'll cut this out. Because the focus is more on the sort of mental health thing. But a while back, we did an episode, and this is all to do with resources in class, right? We had a child clinical psychologist. She'd written this book, and it was about self-directed learning and challenging some of the principles of what school is for. Now, granted, the focus is much more on Brit than America. But she used sort of various examples from around the world. And one of the things she was talking about with literacy was that, and again, I'll stress this is about resources and class. It was more entertaining the idea that there's clearly better ways of doing things out there, but it requires obviously money and time and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that was quite, not necessarily alarming, but surprising was this thing about that in the particular contexts, when kids weren't pushed to learn to read, that they eventually would, given that the material is around them as they're growing up, that's a big caveat, that there's actually all this stuff around them that would stimulate them, that there would be really late readers. Like it wouldn't be till their teens, like they're 14 or 15, and then they would just dive into books and love books and then run off to university and study English literature or something like that. But in the sort of traditional school system, that would be incredibly alarming, right? You have to achieve certain targets by a certain point in time. And so I'm wondering what your response to that idea is, that someone might start reading from just out of their own desire to do it, versus what your experience has been, what you're seeing, what you're talking about with the literacy rate not going anywhere since the 1960s. Do you have any sort of thoughts on or reflections on any of that stuff?
I have evidence beyond school children. So, like, we've seen the decline in reading rates and the decline in the ability for vast parts of the population to read comprehensible text for a while. However, in general, I was also a late reader. I didn't start reading until I was about 10 years old. The catch to this is that most educational research done in universities, actually, they'll put the caveat on this as well. It's based off of, we know that you need resources, et cetera. I'm going to sound like Freddie DeBoer for a second, but they're actually really only studying a certain class of student. One of the things that we have seen now, this is where I am going to sound like an internet doomer, is we have compounding problems with literacy. So everybody across society reads less, just in general. And there's plenty of reasons why. Most of it has to do first with television, then with computing, and then with social media altogether, and all of those over time tending to the visual media.
Hang on, just as a side then, do you think that's part of the draw? Because the stuff that you make is super engaging, but you're often referencing books, right? Are people paying to have your interpretation of books that they don't want to read?
Yes. And they also don't know how to contextualize what's rare. That's also why you have all these weird political movements that are sprouting up with people making pretty bizarre claims because they're making literature available for free, and increasingly good information resources on anything are behind paywalls. That's a newish development, but it's one that's pretty serious. And this is not to say, I'm not actually one of these people who thinks that everyone needs to go and read the classics. That's not really my point. Although there are a lot of benefits to a classical education, but my point is more that if you have students around books, there's a window when they start to read that's as late as you said, early teens. If they are exposed to books, they will pick that up. However, if they are not exposed to books, and there is a cultural norm of which books are useless, and I will say that it is. This is anecdotal, but I have seen a marked increase in students in my creative writing classes and whatever who say that they do not read. And then my first response is, why do you want to write?
Amazing. But hang on, I imagine business books must be really popular, because aren't business courses like most subscribed to courses, whether that's, I don't know, at university level or lower, as it were. Surely this sort of rich dad, poor dad, like how to be fucking wealthy and dominate everyone, like those kind of books. I feel like if people are going to reach for a book, presumably that's a way in to reading for some people, right?
I think that's only a way into people that have a certain amount of a certain level of career, a certain level of money.
I don't know. I think they're aspirational, aren't they? Isn't it this whole thing of like, regardless of where you are on the economic ladder, isn't it this thing of it fits alongside the prosperity gospel vibe stuff, right?
I have never come across a person that didn't at least have some money to invest at some point in their life ever pick up one of those books.
I've seen people who picked it up who are poor, but I think we overestimate that demographic, which that Poor Dad, for example, is one of the most best-selling books of all time. Ironically, the guy who wrote it, Sagi, only became wealthy by selling books about how to become wealthy, and a lot of the advice in it is actively terrible. But yeah, I have a brother who got into that. But my family is actually an interesting class intersection here, and I don't normally talk about this, but I will on this show. I have two brothers who are high school dropouts, one brother who, at this point, has a PhD in physical therapy. Which one do you think reads Rich Dad, Poor Dad?
That's a good question.
The PhD in physical therapy. The two high school dropouts who now touch it, they do not have those aspirations, and you're not seeing those amongst the young. So what do I mean by that? Most of the students I teach, and I teach a pretty interesting slice of the United States. Utah is a relatively prosperous state, and it does have poverty, of course, but actually compared to a lot of the other places I've lived in the United States, its poverty rates are fairly low. It still has, because of religious institutions, a fairly integrated external to the state social safety net that is religious between the Catholic Church and the LDS. So there is that as unique here. But I teach in a school it's not a charter school, it's a public school program, but it's for an entire district, and the district spans, like a lot of districts in Utah around the urban areas, both very poor and very well-off parts of the county. So I have a cross-section of nouveau riche tech people and people who have made money off of land speculation. And I point that out because that's a kind of wealth. And as a teacher, one of the sad things I can tell you is I can tell people's class by the way their parents act, more often than not. And I think most people who have a lot of experience with large sectors of the population can do this. But like with the wealthy, it really matters how they're wealthy. There's different traits. So if we're doing like sociological analysis and you're talking about aggregate trends, like nouveau riche people in the suburbs tend to be conservative, but they also tend to be highly indulgent with their children. And so I teach a lot of those. And then I teach a lot of like poor Latin and Polynesian immigrants and a lot of generationally poor like white Mormons. So I teach all those groups, right? I have also in different times taught the mostly black schools, but the racial demographics out here in the West is different. And one of the things I hate about the way we report stuff about, say, people of color is that we assume all the racial and cultural patterns are the same and basically based off black people. They absolutely are not. So, for example, gender dynamics between different poor minority groups are very different. For example, in black families, there's a much higher tendency to educate women than in, say, Latin families. Now, all of this is dangerously close to being essentialized. So I want to say this too. I will tell you, in aggregate, a lot of these stats are true. But when people try to reduce them down to the individual, and educators, they tend to make horrible mistakes. So, again, in any one context, it's very different. So we talk about Latin students. I teach Venezuelan, Chicano, New Mexican immigrants, Salvadorian immigrants, etc. And also because I happen to live in Mexico and speak Spanish, although not well, but enough to know the differences between the dialects and stuff. I can tell people's class background in their home country. And there are dramatic differences there too. No one in the United States school system is actually studying that granular. Nobody. Those studies do not exist. I've looked for them. All right. What are we dealing with when we deal with literacy rates amongst English language learners from X specific country within a subgroup? Now, there are some like broad ones, like the difference between Asian students, Latin students, et cetera. The difference between black students who speak a vernacular basis of English or poor white students, et cetera. One of the interesting things I remember about African-American vernacular debates, which used to be called Ebonics, is that I came from a social class in the South that understood it. So people would talk about it wasn't, and there's reasons. The reason why they're actually trying to file it under a different language back in the 90s was for funding, because there's more funding for language learning than there was for helping students catch up. I got into the Stuart Hall code switching thing and validation of in-home language while teaching people to speak, quote, standard English, which there is no standard English anywhere, but particularly in the United States. But let's just say white middle class English, right? And I got into teaching people to code switch and talk about validation of home language, but you have to treat it like EL. And how I did that was I did use EL techniques. So that, for people who don't know my acronyms here, I'm just talking about English language learners. You just treat it as like you have two languages, even though they're both varieties of English. Very effective. Very validating because people know they're putting on the quote white voice or whatever, but they know what they're doing. But again, cultural trends are different. Generational poverty trends are different. Accesses are different. So one of the things to bring it back to your thing about books in the home, I just need to remind people in the Southeast in the United States, where still the great majority of African Americans are, my babysitter, because we were very poor white people, and I think this was an old black woman who was illiterate. She was illiterate because they didn't have the schools yet. She had no social security number because they didn't give those to black people in the 30s and 40s. Had no way to really get benefits from that. And had grown up as a sharecropper aide. That was in the 1980s. All right. Why am I bringing that up? There's no way that the first or second generation of her kids had access to the things to just spontaneously start picking up literacy. And she was a smart woman. She learned how to read, I think, in her 70s. But I say that because for a lot of people today, that fact feels very distant. Because that's the 1930s, almost 100 years ago. But my point in bringing that up is, yeah, but the generations raised by those people are in their 40s and 50s. So you're only 3 to 4 generations out from massive systemic poverty and underprivilege in the case of the black community. The gains there have been actually astronomical. So one area where we've seen a lot of gains in like college attendance and stuff like that. But here's an interesting factor that I think that to bring it back to the mental health issue. I had mentioned earlier, suicidal ideation amongst minority groups in the United States was generally pretty low. One of the reasons that people have posited for this, and they've never been able to prove it, but that being a marginalized community actually strengthened community ties through general opposition. And so there were informal social network supports for people. This is actually being studied about like impoverished cultures in general. And there's a lot of sociology. Sociology is dangerous. There's a tendency to overgeneralize from it. But there's a lot of sociology that talks about like how formal community structures are relatively intact amongst impoverished groups who aren't highly urbanized. And even some places that are. And that seems to be a good check on suicidal ideation. But it's not true anymore. Meaning, and it's the atomization and alienation of younger students does not seem to be as set off by the old community ties. Meaning the alienation that we see amongst, say, middle class people is becoming more and more common even amongst poorer people. And that's greatly concerning because people are usually the one resource poorer people have. So there's whole things about like the way if you grow up relatively impoverished, how you will work a lot harder to maintain relationships because that is your wealth. That is your means of survival. It's totally rational. But if that alienation and social fragmentation is like now even undoing the kind of counter tendencies that happen in poverty, you now have a group of people opening up to the kinds of problems that you see in middle class people with even less resources.
Wow. And also I can imagine that going to the social media thing, having this being more connected than ever, but actually what you're being exposed to is presumably just a whole bunch of things just being rubbed in your face, right? Like the COVID thing was a prime example of, to my mind, at least maybe what I was seeing was these super rich billionaires just getting richer and richer during that whole period. Meanwhile, everyone's just scrambling to put their lives back together or whatever, and there's people delivering food and all the resources that you need that are being told they're essential workers and then being discarded and doing this dangerous work. And it just felt so, the system is obviously unfair, but it, particularly during COVID, it felt so in your face. And so I can imagine that, I don't know, like having access to just other people's lives, but even celebrities, and seeing them on that level, it's, what's the saying? That comparison is the thief of joy. I'm sure that must play a part.
I mean, it's a driver of certain kind of alienation. This is where my like kind of strict Marxism comes in. But the alienation of worker from worker is because of the striving and competition it inculcates in people, which tends to break down communities. And so one of the things that when we talk about social media, it's a lot of these trends, I think, and here I'm going off of research. It's not directly related to my job. And here it is more speculative, but I have stats to back up some of the assertion. We've seen these trends since the 1960s, to the first downturn of Fordism and the end of like the social compact period in U.S. life. And it's interesting because I wish someone did a comparative study, and it's getting harder and harder to do as we are further and further out, of like social attitudes during the 1950s and 60s between the UK, Europe, and Americans tied into their wealth strata. All right, because all Americans truly were relatively prosperous even compared to Europeans. Now in the 1990s, during the height of the first period neoliberalization, and I say first period because the second period after 2001 to 2007 is a very different period. It would be interesting to see because that's when you start really seeing these exacerbations of impoverishment in the United States and wealth inequalities being more generalized and much higher than that. There were societies that were higher in the 1990s, like China, for example, which is more equal than the United States now, but in the 1990s, it was higher. Believe it or not, we're leading the Dennis period. So you could do interesting studies on the effects of that. I don't know that they've been done. And I also think they're going to be harder and harder to do the further out you are. Because you're basically going to have to extrapolate from evidence, from like literary evidence, from any sociological studies, what those things are. You can't do active research because people now, even if they lived in that time period, are not under those conditions. You can't just ask them what they thought and get an honest answer. Because they don't probably, you don't have access to that, even yourself, after 20, 30 years. So we don't know. And that's something. I mean, one of the things, to get back to something we mentioned very early when we talk about children and things like suicide, is in the beginnings of this current suicidal ideation wave, right, which was in the mid-teens, there was a lot of pushback for people like me who were really worried that our standard of comparisons were the 90s and the early aughts. In the 90s and the early aughts were interesting because you actually did have a massive decline in teen suicides. And it seems to have come from awareness, like awareness of teen suicide, being on guard for it, etc. But that stopped, and at first I was like, okay, maybe they have a point. Maybe it is just a return to the norm. Maybe we're just not getting the gain from awareness anymore. But now we're looking at things. No, things are higher than they've been since we've been recording these stats. Here's a fact that blew my mind. Youth deaths are up, right? Your immediate thoughts are, okay, car wrecks, alcoholism, drug overdoses. Get this, it's also increased with heart attacks.
Wow.
Yeah.
When they're 25.
Jesus.
And that's not just in the US, by the way. It's also in the UK.
Is that chronic stress or like bad diets or?
We don't really know. Like, it does not seem to be directly tied to the obesity epidemic. One of the things about the obesity epidemic, for example, is people have been portraying that it was going to lead to this massive decline in life expectancy. We are seeing a life expectancy decline in the United States, but it's not actually to obesity-related diseases. If you're in a southern state right now, your life is likely to be like almost a decade shorter because of poor health care, alcoholism, drug overdoses, and seizures. That's what's lowering the average life expectancy in those areas. And those are the poorer states too, which also, as I'm saying, means that the whole like impoverishment is not actually comorbid with suicidal ideation. That used to be traditionally true, no longer true. People are dying deaths of despair. And we're seeing evidence of that in younger people, but we don't know why. One of the things that's hard to say is, okay, you say stress, but what's causing the stress? Kids now are less likely to work. They have less homework. There's more competition for everything, but a lot of kids just choose not to compete. So there's fewer kids going to college for the first time in forever. And not just in raw numbers, because you'd expect that anyway, because the current generations are smaller, but also in relative numbers. A lot of the growth in U.S. colleges comes from foreign students. So what is that telling you? And it's very complicated to know. So my answer would be like, we have evidence for all of it and none of it. There's other comorbid things too, like more people, like there might be more people on drugs with heart stress for other things. There are knockoff effects of drugs, both licit and illicit. However, just to throw another wrench in this, drug use amongst youth has declined. So we can't really blame that either.
One of the things that's really interesting is the choosing not to compete, because, yeah, how does that present itself? Because on one hand, I can imagine that it's a completely logical decision. As you said, like striving or competition breaks communities, which I think is a really interesting observation. But you can see how when you see the state of things, you'd be like, yeah, I don't want to play this game. It's fucked. And so there's a wisdom in it. And there is something about checking out, which is like self-protection, right? But on the other hand, there's also, where do you go from there? If you're not going to compete, what do you do?
It gets toxic. Let's talk about incels, for example. Non-competition. That is relying on the bitterness of non-competition. Like it's almost a cult-like mentality. Very hard to break people out of. I know people who like literally their job is to work and try to do this. And part of it is because some of the things that the incels believe about their prospects aren't wrong. Who they're blaming is wrong, right? Blaming women. Put it this way, there's been a feminization of academia until the higher levels. And this, I think, is actually proof of what we might call patriarchy. But what I mean by that is like, you have increasingly high numbers of women going to college. That you see this everywhere until you get to PhD programs, where it floats back to favoring men. But if you think about how few people are in PhD programs, it's not like this is a general benefit to men. There's just a structural sexism in universities. The university life is incredibly hard on families. And women can have people with uteruses, let me be trans-inclusive here, can have children. And that complicates things greatly in the academic field. Conservatives will sometimes just say, oh, it's not really sexism because I mean sexism is bigotry and not sexism is a structural impediment. But, okay, but what does that mean? You have a ton of men who don't go to college. Okay, they don't see the permanent point in it. They see it, that it can rack up a massive amount of debt, but they're unlikely to get jobs in the fields that it would benefit them for the most part, unless they go very far into it. A lot of people's experience of school is, it's their first interaction with the state, unless you're one of the few people who also have family members in the prison system, which in the United States, you must remember, touches 1 in 10 people. But still, there's reasons why people hate school. Like, I always tell people, teachers aren't cops, but we also aren't not. The reason why we're not cops is we can't just shoot you.
That's a whole other aspect that's a whole other aspect of this as well, isn't it? You talked about depression, suicide, anxiety, heart attacks, school shootings, right?
Yeah.
I saw some chart the other day. It's like over 600 a year now or something. It's mad.
Yeah, although, okay, I'm going to say something that maybe is going to get me in a little bit of trouble. Most of that 600 is gang-related. You hear about the ones that aren't. Notice you only hear about so many a year. That's because they're not gang-related. They're not explainable under those kinds of activity. In the 1980s, which is not a time people think about a high number of school shootings, there was a ton of them. They were all gang.
Right.
Yeah, it's like the mass shooting narrative in general. A lot of what gets labeled by definition mass shootings, a lot of it is like domestic disputes.
Yeah, there's a school up the street from me that's on that list. That right outside of the school, there was a drug deal related shooting that killed 2 teenage students, or 3 teenage students. No, 2 teenage students died and 1 was shot and survived. That's on that list, right? And should be. But when we only focus on like the random shooter events, we're not really looking at what's driving that.
Right.
Which, by the way, is the drug war and handguns. Still, even though the drug war's gotten better in the United States, still exists. So that's what drives that. I'm not, in theory, against police abolition. I think defunding police is dumb. And by that, you're going to take the money away from the people with all the guns. They sell all the guns. I want you to think about how that's going to go for you. Like, in a very basic sense. So I was like, you either go hard and replace this institution entirely, or you reform it. You can't half-ass in the middle. But regardless of my stance on that, what we can see for sure is that despite liberalization, despite some finally pushing back on the drug war, despite decriminalization of marijuana or the United States, there's a whole violent gray economy that we have subjected, all right, people, and I've been accused of being racist talking about this, but my point is not that it's mostly poor minorities. It's not mostly poor minorities, even. Statistically speaking, it's not. But there's a whole violent economy around this that we don't look at. It disproportionately affects young people. Disproportionately affects the very poor. It disproportionately affects the vulnerable, new immigrants, etc. And the best way that we can get rid of it would be poverty reduction, decriminalizing vast swaths of non-lethal drugs, even though I say this with I don't know that we should be encouraging them or even make them fully legal, but decriminalizing them. And then we can talk about some other things you can do. But until you have that handled, and it's going to take a couple of generations to handle, even if we had socialism in America tomorrow, some of these social problems would take 2 or 3 generations to fix, which I don't think anybody likes to hear.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, like how drugs are wrapped up into all of this stuff, because a recent guest we had on, she was talking about the reason that she took various substances when she first started as a teen was because it was fun. It's the big part that's missing from a lot of the drug debate, is that a lot of them are enjoyable substances at first, but it makes a lot of sense. The picture you're painting, no wonder people are like, nah, if I'm going through all these things and I don't believe that there's a place for me in society or in the future, then it makes sense that you'd go, hey, look, right here I can have some sort of sense of a buzz.
You see, still, this is less of a problem now than it was in the 1990s. The drugs part.
Right.
Like, the violence part of that's tied into that culture, right? But this is not what's driving most kids. Most kids are too addicted to their cell phone to go out and get the drugs. I'm not being like, to be completely frank, flashy numbers on the screen that gives you a dopamine hit is fun at first, till it increases your anxiety and everything else. But yeah, I know what to do a lot of recreational drugs. And in my generational cohort was the cohort that was probably doing like a vast majority of them, which is Gen X, older millennials. I used to be really fascinated with this because, for example, kids, drug addiction, and let's say lots and lots of recreational sex that is unhealthy, not using protection, etc. Where would that happen in the 1990s? You'd always see it like in places where there was nothing for kids to do. All places, urban places where all the public spaces have been removed. We've had 3 decades of that now. The only reason why I think it's not a bigger problem, and this is where I'm going to, for all we want to blame smartphones keep people entertained enough that they don't do a lot. It is cheap enough to access. So they're not doing the fun drugs because they're playing the stupid video games or watching the fun TikToks. Like there is and I know that sounds very naive, but I have real evidence for that. So it's just, when everyone talks about like these social media things, I do think they're pernicious. Don't get me wrong, but you can't. Everyone talks about this stuff as if you're not looking at this larger social spectrum and the way they all interrelate. So yes, there's downsides to TikTok, there's downsides to Instagram, downsides to Facebook, there's definitely fucking downsides to Twitter. Although most kids don't use Twitter. Twitter is a literati thing, honestly. What we see really is that there are some pro-social side effects to this as far as the standpoint. Although sometimes I'm like, you know what? Maybe it would be good for these kids to have sex. I don't know. Why? It's a dangerous thing to say, and particularly in current society. And I know I'm not encouraging young kids, but like, you're meeting people who aren't dating well into their 20s.
Teen sex has dropped. Teen drug use has dropped. And a huge part of why overdose has gone up is not so much of use, the street supply being very potent, iron law prohibition and all that. Yeah. And again, it's also one of those things where, like the attitude towards sex has seemed to change in many ways with my generation.
Because of pro-sexual identity, but they seem pretty uninterested in actual sex, which I think is like,
yeah. And granted, obviously, the people that I come across are not necessarily representative cross sections of society, but some of the 18, 19, early 20s year olds that I have seen, because one of the things that I do is try and provide sexual health information online, is a lot of them are having unprotected sex that they are absolutely not enjoying at all. And that's what really breaks my heart, is that of many activities, sexual activity should be something that if you're going to partake in it, you should enjoy it. I no longer know the state of sex education in the United States anymore.
It pretty much doesn't exist in a lot of states.
Which was the impression that I got from speaking to a lot of people. So there is a lot of misinformation, but one of the things that's our generation in terms of like condom use and testing, because we grew up partially in the era of AIDS before all the antiviral treatment, right? So that was like the only time where condoms and testing, it feels like, became at least something that could be broached more openly.
Yeah, it's not anymore. One of the things you can say if someone gets a STI now, that the social consequences feel more severe. And one of the things that I was going to add to that is like there's an overexposure to kinds of sex acts, but it does seem like there's a deficit of enjoyment. And I was reading recently some studies talking about like, quote, rough sex in college. That's a variable term. I don't want to get too much into what that means, but it's considered now a majority habit amongst college students. But it actually seems to, even when totally consensual and seemingly enjoyed, the fears and anxieties around that seem to be one of the many factors that are discouraging that. So one thing I'm going to say, and I don't want to sound like a prude here, but since so many people's exposure to sexuality is primarily through the ubiquity of porn, and particularly some kinds of porn, that's changed sexual habits dramatically. We do have to acknowledge that beyond all sexism and exploitation or whatever else you see in that it's had larger implications, but not really the ones that we thought. All right. And it's not just about like consent problems anymore. There's still plenty of that. There's still plenty of rape culture, if you want to call it that. But it's not just that. And the unrealistic expectations, so I even see this in like cultural norms, like young people, younger millennials and boomers do not see the point of sex scenes in movies because they see them pretty much as always exploitative and like they have very little purpose other than coloration. And there's also a lot of weird, incoherent amongst college students right now, guilt and morality, where people are super accepting of different sexual lifestyles and practices, but also like super tied up in how they are, how those practices are now politically perceived. And I find that fascinating. Like the amount of anxiety of politicizing your intimate relationships in some way is actually becoming a barrier to those intimate relationships themselves. And you definitely see this in young people. And I think you see it down into older high school students, like 16, 17-year-olds. They don't, by and large, a lot of them just do not date. And it's not because they have less time. That's not the reason. If they have less time, it's because they're spending it on other things, but they're not spending it on jobs. They're much less likely to work people very recently. There's been a little bit of reversal of that trend, but not a lot. They're not spending it on studying homework. So what are they spending it on? And then the old boomer in me wants to yell about Snapchat and TikTok, and I'm sure that's part of it, but it's not, but even that's not all.
The impression that I get from a lot of young adults is the amount of social anxiety people have around other people seems to be a lot more like pathological and intense. So on one hand, we have less bullying and less bigotry. And the curious thing about this whole thing is that in an environment of less bullying and less bigotry, you would think that sociality would increase. But on the other hand, it's also not increasing.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I've been pondering for a while. There's a couple of speculative ideas I have of this, but I'm caveating this. On this, I don't have proof. One, technological mediation of social interaction actually leads to the atrophy of certain kinds of skills, but you still pick up the information because you're still a human, but you don't know what to do with it. So what do I mean by that? When you interact with someone through a text and through a screen, you actually don't have to read body language and all that in the same way. You actually off-source a lot of that to the app or to emojis or to whatever. And that's perfectly reasonable and not bad. But if you do that as your primary form of social interaction for a long time, when confronted with actual social interaction with people you don't know, where you're alert and also picking up on these signals, but you don't know you're picking up on these signals, it's going to be overwhelming. That's one theory I have. There are some people who are playing with this idea. I haven't seen anybody really do a lot with it yet. Two, surveillance society is real, and it's normalized. The idea of a private world and a private life has almost been deleted for people under 35. As a 40-year-old who sometimes, not just as a teacher, but also I'm a leftist and an activist, so I deal with a lot of 20-somethings a lot, and as 30-somethings. And when I was single and dating a few years ago, I was also dating some people in their 30s. We had completely different attitudes towards privacy. Now, I did that. I get that it's been normalized, and there's a certain amount of you just show yourself shame and stuff anymore. But also, it makes every interaction where you are being watched and observed and potentially broadcast at all times. So now you have the anxiety of always playing yourself. This is something the theorist Bong Chul-han talks about, and I think he might be onto something there. But I've seen it. The number of 504s I get for anxiety, 504s are a kind of federal accommodation for educational accommodations that are legally binding, but they're not for quote, special ed, unquote. They're for medical conditions. And we've seen an exponential increase in those. Part of that is that you can get them from a doctor and get a lot of benefits from them. So not to sound somewhat cynical, but middle-class people will use them. But also, seriously, it was part of that scam. Like people might remember 6 or 7 years ago where there's this massive elite scam about testing modifications. The 504s were how a lot of those testing modifications were gotten that allowed for a lot of the cheating rings. But I also think there's a real increase in these because a lot of them are like poor kids who had a doctor diagnose them with anxiety. They're poor kids, meaning they had to really fight for the parents to go get that diagnosis, to go to a clinic. It's probably not easy for them to get. It must have been really debilitating for them to use public services in the United States to pay the $100 for your copay or whatever for your crappy end of Obamacare insurance to go get that. That would have been a major cost to their families. So I think that's pretty sincere. I don't think that anyone's gauging the system with that. We've seen an exponential number of growth for those boring anxiety. I have a bunch of kids who literally, if you ask them to stand up and give a speech in front of people, I've had this happen more than once. It's required in our standards to do it. So there's been times where kids did not have those accommodations and I have to make them do it. And they literally go into a
panic attack.
Yeah, just straight up panic attack, start balling up. And this has happened at least 4 times in the past 5 years. It doesn't happen to me so much anymore because when they do this public speaking mediated through a computer, they actually feel a little bit safer.
So last week, Ecoy and the guest Megan had this thing that they were saying that confidence isn't necessarily walking into the room thinking you're the shit. It's just that it's the belief that you can learn whatever situation you're put into, that you have a trust in your own ability to navigate the environment you're about to be put in. And it makes so much sense what you're saying about if everything's being mediated through screens, then social interactions, like you said, there's all this extra information, you feel overwhelmed, and then you have anxiety. And it's like the complete polar opposite end of feeling like I can learn, I can figure this out, I believe that I will be okay in this situation. Instead, it's like you said, like a panic attack, right? That's the dots I'm connecting, at least. I don't know if that has a basis in reality.
Yep. And I think also when we talk about incels and love amongst young people, people have pointed out that, these dating apps only encourage you to care about the most superficial elements of true enough. Actually, I think there's some truth to that. But there's also something else. It outsources all the skills that you would have to develop to understand if someone is receptive to you or not. Because if they're on a dating app and they click yes, that's already done that work for you. Therefore, there's all kinds of issues about consent, bring it back to the consent issue, that it's now going to be real anxiety producing because that's now offset to an app to some degree, right? You don't have to read people's body language. You don't have to deal with the subtleties of consent and the way people broadcast that. I do think it's a great thing that now increasingly we just say it. As an old dude who's been in the dating pool a couple of different times in my life, it's a lot easier when you're just like, it's just yes or no. But I think there's a whole lot of social resources that you still, even in those physical interactions, have to understand how to navigate people's emotion that you've all sourced to other things. That's perfectly natural. Like when people talk about this, they want to get blamey about it, right? And I'm like, no, fuckers, everybody's lazy. Like that, it is natural to be lazy. You got to conserve resources to survive. Hard work is good for you. And also some ways, though, if you work yourself ragged in the wild and you don't have to, you're also pretty easy prey. So not to over extrapolate from evolutionary biology, which again, evolutionary psych is a highly questionable field. But in this sense, I do think I studied anthropology in college and it just seems of course we conserve resources. Duh. Who doesn't? Right. And so these apps really do help you conserve resources, but it does come at a cost. And some of the cost is not going to be, for example, there's a cost to rote memory when we learned how to write. We have evidence of non-literate cultures who have oral traditions that are pretty highly accurate, that involve massive memorization and memorization of things that aren't just linguistic even. We have pretty strong evidence from those cultures that there was a trade-off when we learned to print, when we learned how to write. That trade-off was totally worth it.
Yeah. Actually, it links to a question I had, which is that in the same way that in the period in time when books were being mass published and distributed, there was a huge moral panic about them as well, and that there was deep concern that people were just disappearing for hours into these books and losing their humanity. To what degree, you said earlier on about being the old man shouting at clouds, like to what degree is some of this stuff like just, it's just different, it's not our era? To what degree is it just moral panic, and to what degree is it like points of concern?
So it's really hard to disentangle all that. One thing I will say, however, that is different. You own your books. You do not own your social media. You do not control it. You are controlled by it. It is an immersive experience which feeds you what it thinks you want. And it will shape your taste in doing so. In a way that like television tried to, but like this is way more, they have way more data to be fine-tuned about it.
But could you not say books? I was thinking of the book and the movie Into the Wild. That guy was very much inspired by some of the books he read to go out into the wilderness, Walden and stuff like that.
Yeah. Books have a social cost. All knowledge is, this is one thing I just want people to be more realistic about. Like, all of this is a trade-off. I think the difference now is that a book does do a lot of things, but it's really affecting your memory, affecting your executive function. So are screens in general affecting your executive function. But you're offsorting more and more of yourself. And with the advent of these machine learning things, which I don't really think are human-like intelligences, that's not my proposition, but they are going to offset a whole lot of like small intellectual work, the way that machines and robots offset a lot of small physical work. They're going to reduce socially necessary labor time, et cetera. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. Right? It's actually not a bad thing. It's a bad thing in the context that we currently exist. These technologies would not necessarily be bad if they weren't also something you didn't own and you didn't really have full access to, and you were at a disadvantage if you don't have access to other things, etc. Now, there's always status access problems between human beings once you get past like relatively subsistence in high egalitarian societies. Right now, one of the things you said about this anxiety and whatnot is we're now aware of those status gains in ways that in modern society we haven't been. So what do I mean by that? In the 20th century, yes, there were vast disparities of wealth, but you don't interact with those people. Most people you interact with are effectively your peers. In the UK, there's some offset of that because you have a formalized pre-modern class system that's still hanging around. But in class anxiety feels fungible. But also, it's partly because you deal with peers most of the time. For example, I always talked about who I used to think was rich. And these were people who made, in the 90s, $80,000 as opposed to my parents who made like 30. Okay, that's a lot of money per year, per over a lifetime. But we're still actually in the same social strata. I don't have any access to that. I didn't have any access to the actual rich until I was very well educated and moving in very elite circles amongst Ivy League graduates and stuff due to a job I had as a professor for a while. And then when I taught in national schools, that's when I learned what real wealth and what wealth disparity was. That's not something that I experienced. So in some ways, it's interesting. And I think we have to think about this in terms of anxiety, but also why people think they can even get these things, right? Is because there's in the United States in particular, there's such a segregation between not just races, but classes. There's a bigger segregation between classes than races in the United States. And poor people interact with people of other races all the time. Not so much. There are places where it breaks down, churches, Las Vegas, etc. But in general, there's not a lot of overlap between even subclasses. It feels very flattening, and it feels like you're being judged by your peers always, but you see these things now on social media that are thrown in your face. So it feels like you could do that.
Yeah, because it's right in your hand.
Experience of the world is a peers.
It's literally in your hand.
So it's not just aspirational, but it's also aspirationally depressing. Conversely, a lot of the way the left handles this, and this I am going to sound like I'm chastising, but I think it's correct, is to treat people in this like they're victims. That does not make people feel better. That doesn't help them. That doesn't relieve their suicidal ideation. Doesn't offset resentment, nor does it give them any answer to the problem. So to tell people they are victims of underprivilege or other privileged people doesn't actually fix the problem. And this is why all this resentment really starts to spurn up, because on one hand, you experience the world relatively egalitarianly in a way that our ancestors like 200 years ago don't. And on the other hand, you're being constantly exposed to how unegalitarian the world actually is.
Part 2 of this conversation continues over on our Patreon. However, it will be available in 1 week's time for free. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Rebecca Johns, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Alexander Lashley, Sheena Belmas, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, Alexandra McCormick, Wig Shaker, Elizabeth McKechnie, J. Daniel Richer, Fontaine, Hartley Wilmoth, and Sean Venardo.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And if you want to hear even more from Harriet, check out her radio show, Interpersonal Update, on WBAI and in the WBAI archives.